What happened for me was that, like you and Circle and so many of you, I'm sure here, I worked for years in the environment and written about it, and just like all you, just did the best I can, the best I could, and looked at the sort of terrible odds and said, well, it doesn't matter, this is what I'm going to do. It's not about winning or losing, it's about actually being effective and where I could be effective. And in the process, over several years, speaking afterwards, people would, reach into their pocket and, give me a business card, and this is a tea bag, let's pretend it's, and give me their card, and I would take it, and if I had one, I'd give them one. And these accumulated in my houseboat where I lived, and a drawer got full, and my housekeeper put it in a bag, and the bag was in my closet, and then that was full, and it was spilling out. And I didn't have anything to do with them, except I just couldn't throw them away. I just couldn't. They were just so precious. But what I noticed was almost every time when I got a card, it was like, never heard of them, never heard of them, never heard of that group, never heard of that organization. Wow, I didn't know that group existed on that riparian corridor. Wow, isn't that great? And wow, this is a bird, this is the Crane Association of Siberian, okay, and just on and on and on. And so I grew up at the University of California, Berkeley. My father worked in the library. In my family, Marion, the librarian, was a heroine, we thought libraries were cool. And when I was a child, I went from grammar school to where my father worked, and then I would just hang out in the stacks, and sit down on any aisle and just plop myself down and start pulling books out by the spine and reading. And so I thought, well, I'll go to the library and find out how many groups are. I want to know how many organizations are there out there working on the environment and social justice and indigenous issues, and surely the library would know. And they didn't know. And then I tried to find out, well, who did know? And I went to Oxford, didn't go personally, but I went to Oxford University and Cambridge, and nobody knew. People had tax records for those who registered. And so then I took that as a challenge, and I wanted to know what's going on here. And so I started counting myself, and I got to 30,000 organizations, and I thought, okay, as a lapsed Catholic, I thought this is as big as the Catholic Church, this is interesting, And then we got to 60,000, 75, 100,000, 150,000, and then we got to, well, was there anything remotely or vaguely this big, in the world? And I couldn't figure out what it would be in terms of organizations. And then I kept going. And it went to 250,000, 500,000, went to 1 million, went to 2 million organizations. And I'm still counting, by the way. And these organizations that directly work on equity, fairness, women's issues, water, food, climate. I can list it. In the book Blessed and Rest, there is 100 and some odd page appendix, which is the taxonomy of these groups. It's just, and it was so much fun. We just gathered the names and we said, well, what do they do? What do they do? And named it. Just, we felt like we were the first botanists of civil society. We could make up our own binomials. And then the question for me is, well, yeah, but where did it come from? Why are we doing this? How do we organize this way? Where are our roots, And it went to two really basic things in history. And there's a wonderful book by Karen Armstrong. If you know her, she's an ex-nun, and she's a fantastic writer. And she wrote a book called the Great Transformation, but she talks about the axial age between 200 and 900 BCE, and it was a time of great, frankly, barbarity and war and cruelty and incivility, and during this time, an extraordinary thing happened in terms of people rising up and leaders rising up, and Mencius and Confucius and Lao Tzu and Buddha and Rabbi Hillel and the Greek philosophers, and she calls this against the actual age, an axis of change, and the axis was a recognition that hadn't occurred before, which is these teachers and philosophers basically were trying to create a new human being. They were looking at what we were as humans and saying, no, we can do better than that, a lot better. And if you look at the readings, then there's a commonality, which is all of them touched upon, like Rabbi Hillel said. He said, never do something to somebody else you would not have done to yourself. He said, that is the Torah. Read it. The rest is commentary. Right? They were all teaching the same thing, and they elaborated it and all, but it was really this idea that our well-being was inseparable from other people's well-being. And who we were and how we identified ourselves was inseparable from how we connected and treated each other. Right? They weren't interested in theocratic religions and monotheism and big cathedrals. And if you really look back at this time, these were social movements. These were not religious movements. They became religion, so be it. But this is a social movement. And it kind of leapfrogged into 1783, and you had the rise of the abolitionist movement in England. And they were ridiculed and scorned and mocked, these abolitionists, because the fact was, from the conservatives' point of view, these people didn't know what they were talking about. They were going to ruin the British economy. My God, you people should not be meddling in areas that you don't understand, economic areas. And you have to remember at that time, 3 out of 4 people in the world were enslaved. It wasn't just a slave trade. It was 3/4 of humanity. And so here are people standing up saying, stop. And what surprised the ministers and the people in Parliament and other critics was, well, why are you even doing this? You don't know these people? If they're freed, you'll have no benefit whatsoever to yourself, direct or indirect. So why could you possibly waste your time doing this? Because at that time, the perception was that if you had a social movement, it was to improve your own lot in life, period. Understandable. But it was the first time that people organized themselves to work on behalf of those whose benefit they would never share, whose people whom they would never meet or know. And now we do it without thinking twice. We think it's normal. It was not normal not that long ago. So here are the 2 kind of roots of civil society. And in America, if I'm getting too historical here, I'm sorry, but I think this informs everything we do. And we have to know that this isn't new. This is deep and ancient in us. This is old. These are core human values that we're expressing. This isn't trying to go in and meddle. This is about transformation. This is about who we are as human beings. Right? And then I thought, okay, in America, which is very powerful in terms of environment and social justice, you have to go back to 1832, and you have to go back to this completely sad, depressed, moody preacher who had lost his wife and took a boat in 1833, Christmas 1832, but 1833 to Malta, and went up the boot of Italy and so forth, and to France, and his name was Ralph Waldo Emerson. You probably don't read much about him here, but he's a big deal where we come from, and he, in his journals, his wife is young, he's young. He's given up preaching the church, he's given up his work, he's given up family, he's a mess. His wife dies of tuberculosis. He hasn't recovered. And he gets to Paris, and he gets to two places, the Jardin du Roi, which is the Jardin du Plan, and the Cabinet of Natural History. And there's two, one's a botanical garden, like the King's Garden, which is a research center, and the Jardin du Roi was a research center, a major European research center in herbs and silviculture, botany, and the Cabinet of Natural History. He goes in there, and what he sees is the plants arrayed by the Duchou, the Bernard de Duchou and his nephew Antoine Laurent Duchou, and he sees the plants arrayed according to taxa, and Wallace and Darwin did too, went to the same place, by the way. Really, the Duchous were really forerunners of evolution, and they didn't have a name for it, but there it was. And then he went to the Cabinet of Natural History, and there was again the bones, the fossils, the wings, the preserved wings of bird, and again birds arrayed in this way where you could see morphology, you could see evolution, and you see that night in Emerson's journal these rhapsodic entries. He's the first time in 2 years that he actually has anything to say that's joyous, because he sees the web of life. He sees it, and he's just gobsmacked, you know. And he's not the first person maybe to see it, but he's one of the very first to see it in the West. He writes then, and for days after, well, everything is nature. We are a part of nature. This is what I was talking about in the beginning, this realization that there's no separation. And within you are the molecules of every species on Earth, in your lungs right now, guaranteed. If they breathe, it's in you. It's a fact. As are the air, oxygen and nitrogen from Bono and Cleopatra and anybody else you like or don't. They're in you. I mean, it is vastly interconnected and intertwined, you know. This illusion, this delusion of separation, of separateness, is just simply our ego. Our ego. And what we're talking about here is waking up. Because when we wake up, then how can we treat people the way we're treating them? How can we treat creatures the way we're treating them? How can we treat the land the way we're treating them? Because it's ourself. This is an ecstatic realization, not a gloomy